Thank you so much, Keith, for that very generous introduction. Thank you as well to all the listeners, to Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group for organizing this event, and also to all my fellow panelists for their outstanding contributions. As Keith mentioned at the start of this webinar, we're gathered here today to mark the 65th anniversary of W.E.B. Du Bois' visit to China, during which he delivered a speech at Beida, Peking University, on his 91st birthday, which is very much worth reading in full. It's been published on the Friends of Socialist China website, and I'll drop a link to it in the chat, or someone else can do so first. This speech is notable for a number of reasons, one of which is that it ties together two strands of Dr. Du Bois' work that are too often examined in isolation or treated as contradictory. The first is his vocal solidarity with China and the USSR, including so-called revolutions from above and the armed suppression of counter-revolution, topics which, of course, are quite controversial, especially in Western left political discourse. And the second strand is, of course, Dr. Du Bois's careful study of the Black liberation struggle during the US Civil War and Reconstruction, as encapsulated in his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America. Now, I contend that these two strands are, in fact, not just inseparable, but for Du Bois, that the former, his internationalist solidarity with socialist revolutions and with indeed the violence that is often necessary to defend them, is actually firmly grounded in his understanding and his careful study of the latter. So looking at the speech itself, there are a number of passages that draw this connection, directly or indirectly. To quote, speaking of China, he said that he spoke as follows, quote, "Behold a people, the most populous nation on this ancient earth, which has burst its shackles, not by boasting and strutting, not by lying about its history and its conquests, but by patience and long suffering, by blind struggle, moved up and on towards the crimson sky. She aims to make men holy, to make men free." That last line, of course, is taken directly from the Civil War era abolitionist anthem, Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is based on the even more militant anthem, John Brown's Body. Elsewhere in the speech, he does warn against this myopic focus on revolutionary violence to the exclusion of social transformations, and again draws an analogy here with US history. He said that, quote, "The essence of the revolution in the Soviet Union and China and in all the Iron Curtain nations is not the violence that accompanied the change, no more than starvation at Valley Forge was the essence of the American Revolution against Britain," end quote. Nonetheless, in his writings on the USSR and China, Dr. Du Bois did prove fully willing to accept the necessity for such violence in the face of potential counter-revolution. And in so doing, he took positions that are today quite historically contentious, especially on the Western left. For example, in a speech that he gave in 1956 entitled "The Theory of Hungary," regarding the Soviet intervention in Hungary that occurred shortly before, he wrote the following, quote, "If before such an onslaught Hungary fell to fascism, then all that terrific effort which had just overthrown Hitler would have been in vain. All of that struggle for socialism, which lasted from 1917 to 1945, against the most powerful nations of the world, would have gone down the drain. The Third World War would have begun. It was the crisis of the 20th century. To the glory of the future of mankind, the Soviet Union rose to the occasion and won for Hungary freedom to build socialism in its own time and its own way," end quote. Pretty striking words, considering that that event is in fact the origin of the pejorative moniker "tanky" for principled anti-imperialists in the Western left. But I would add that it's hard not to imagine that in writing this, Dr. Du Bois had in mind, in fact, another historical episode, namely the violent end of Reconstruction. The period that marked the closest the United States has ever come to a bona fide social revolution in its own territory, and which was violently crushed at the hands of the Ku Klux Klan and its allies. Indeed, the analogies run quite deep between the US Civil War and especially the Eastern Front of World War II, and subsequently as well between the processes of Reconstruction in the US South and of socialist construction during the Cold War in the Eastern Bloc. And this is vitally important to remember, I think, so soon after May 9th, the anniversary of victory over Nazism in Europe, at a time when that historical memory is more distorted and contested than ever, not just in Eastern Europe where the battle took place, but throughout the NATO countries. So to wit, these are, I think, some of the important similarities between the two processes, which I'm sure did not escape W.E.B. Du Bois's attention either. One was that both wars, the Civil War and World War II in Europe, resulted in the destruction of political economic regimes that were founded on extreme forms of racial domination. Of course, chattel slavery in the US South and Nazism in Europe. Another similarity is that in the post-war period, the reconstruction of the US South and the rebuilding of Eastern Europe were both social revolutions that were intended to abolish the material and the ideological foundations for slavery and fascism at a breakneck pace. They were also predominantly revolutions from above, so to speak, implemented largely by a progressive minority that was empowered to govern populations that have been conditioned by centuries of anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, respectively. And in both cases, these empowered progressive minorities were ultimately backed by the military might of liberating armies that were in many ways perceived as foreign by the occupied populations, namely the Union Army after the Civil War and the Red Army in Eastern Europe. Over the course of their historical development, both revolutionary processes, were ultimately defeated by counter-revolution. And in a particular way that I think is understudied. Namely, both of these counter-revolutions, the one in 1877 that ended Reconstruction in the US, and the one that overthrew socialism in the Eastern Bloc in 1989 to 91, what they did was they united whites in cross-class alliances that were fundamentally sutured by white supremacy and across geographical divides. The North-South divide in the United States in 1877 and the East-West divide in Europe in 1989. And furthermore, both of those defeats paved the way for accelerated US imperialism, principally continental imperialism after the defeat of Reconstruction, and then global US imperialism in the multipolar era, in the unipolar era, which is thankfully now coming to a close after the end of the Cold War. So, we've explored this analogy in depth in the case of Dr. Du Bois's writings on Eastern Europe and in particular Hungary. The thing is that, his well-informed embrace of this need for so-called revolution from above, when revolution from below is insufficient on its own, extended also to China, and specifically an event that occurred just weeks after his aforementioned speech in 1959, namely the liberation of Tibet from serfdom and theocratic rule, which occurred with the help of the People's Liberation Army. To wit, in a speech that Dr. Du Bois gave in 1960 entitled Socialism and the American Negro, he said the following with regards to China and Tibet in particular. Quote, "Perhaps our most unforgivable deed today is our attitude toward China. We hate China. We propose never to forgive the Chinese. We count them outside humanity. We charge them with every crime we can invent. I was on the borders of Tibet last year when China saved the Tibetan slaves, and we shed crocodile tears. We have sympathy and money for the slave drivers who hold the Dalai Lama as prisoner," end quote. And I think in this last line in particular, his considered use of the term slave drivers is very notable, especially as it alludes directly to an earlier reference in the same speech that referred specifically to racialized chattel slavery in the U.S. Again, as a regime of horrific domination that was ended through a combination of bona fide social revolution and through military intervention. I want to sort of conclude with the following thought, which is to recall that Dr. Du Bois was visiting Beijing in 1959 as an honored guest of the Chinese government. And we must recognize that this is just one expression of the fact that the latter, the government of China, led by Chairman Mao Zedong, reciprocated the support of Dr. Du Bois and so many other Black revolutionaries for their revolutionary project by supporting, in turn, the incipient Black-led revolution from below in the United States, including its most radical and militant expressions. As Keith mentioned at the start of this webinar, Chairman Mao, in April of 1968, in a speech entitled "A New Storm Against Imperialism," said the following, quote, "Some days ago, Martin Luther King, the Afro-American clergyman, was suddenly assassinated by the US imperialists. Martin Luther King was an exponent of nonviolence. Nevertheless, the US imperialists did not on that account show any tolerance toward him, but used counter-revolutionary violence and killed him in cold blood. This has taught the broad masses of Black people in the United States a profound lesson. It has touched off a new storm in their struggle against violent repression, sweeping well over 100 cities in the United States, a storm such as has never taken place before in the history of that country. It shows that an extremely powerful revolutionary force is latent in the more than 20 million Black Americans," end quote. Notably, just a week after that speech by Mao, as part of this new storm of struggle, the Student Afro-American Society at Columbia University in New York led an occupation of Hamilton Hall. This was in protest directly of Columbia's complicity in Vietnam War research and in the gentrification and displacement of the Black population of Harlem. This famous occupation lasted for a week before its violent eviction by NYPD. And notably, the president of the Student Afro-American Society at that time, Raymond Brown, recalled later in an interview in 2018 that, quote, "Chairman Mao sent us a telegram pledging solidarity to the Black students of Hamilton Hall." The contents of this telegram I have not been able to dig up, so any assistance regarding that would be very much appreciated. Nonetheless, I think that this historical episode is very worth remembering, considering that 56 years later to the day, Columbia students, of course, demanding an end, this time to Zionist occupation and genocide in Palestine, once again occupied Hamilton Hall, renaming it Hind's Hall, in honor of the martyred 60-year-old Palestinian girl, Hind Rajab. And through this and the preceding encampment, Columbia again became the catalyst for a student uprising in this country, unprecedented in scale since 1968, which has transfixed the attention of the world on the revolutionary anti-imperialist struggle of the US youth for the first time in generations. Now, we've all seen, of course, the incredibly moving images of material and verbal solidarity with US student revolutionaries from their counterparts on the front lines of the resistance in Palestine, Yemen, and elsewhere in the region. But I want to conclude by noting that Chinese social media as well have been awash with images of the US student revolt, whose scale and timing have drawn inevitable comparisons to yet another recent anniversary, one with great historical significance, namely the May 4th movement of 1919. And considering that movement became in many ways the nucleus of the Chinese Revolution, which triumphed in 1949 and whose triumph extends today, I think that comparison from so many millions of Chinese, whose eyes are transfixed on what's happening in the United States right now, is both a weighty responsibility for this movement and an inestimable honor. And it stands, of course, in a long and illustrious historical tradition of anti-imperialist solidarity extending both ways across the Pacific. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.